As US-China trade tensions escalate, a different kind of battle is playing out on TikTok, where Chinese factory workers are revealing how luxury goods are really made and questioning why made in China still means less. These videos aren't just content, they're pushback against tariffs, against invisibility, and against the idea that value comes from branding, not labor. In this video, we're diving into the rise of factory TikTok, the growing backlash over what it reveals, and the controversy over whether these viral claims are real, exaggerated, or something in between. It started quietly, during the early days of the pandemic, when the world was frozen and supply chains were under strain, and Chinese factories, long used to working in silence behind the brands, found themselves facing a new kind of crisis. Too much inventory, too few buyers, and growing uncertainty about what the future of global manufacturing would look like. At the same time, the Trump administration was ratcheting up tariffs on Chinese imports, hitting manufacturers hard and fueling a trade war that wasn't just about goods and taxes, but about control, leverage, and national identity. And in that pressure cooker, something unusual happened. Factory workers and small-scale manufacturers in China turned on their phone cameras and started talking, not through government channels or company spokespeople, but directly to the global audience they had never been allowed to address before, using TikTok not just as a marketing tool, but as a stage to show the truth of how luxury goods are made, how much they cost to produce, and what the supply chain looks like from the inside, not the showroom. At first, the videos were simple. A worker standing beside a table full of leather, calmly explaining that the bag they were assembling, one that sells for thousands in a boutique, costs just a fraction to make, and that the same factories producing goods for the world's most prestigious fashion houses were also willing to sell direct, cutting out the middlemen and exposing the markup. But the videos didn't stop there. They started naming names, pointing to specific suppliers, identifying the regions where Zara's shoes or Lululemon's leggings were made, calling out OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, that have long worked anonymously under contract, building white-label products for Western brands who insist on exclusivity while relying on mass production. What had been open secrets in China, which factories made which goods, which provinces specialized in which materials, suddenly became global content, watched by millions, commented on, and debated by consumers who had never thought to question where their so-called luxury really came from, or who made it. And with each new post, the tone shifted, from curiosity to critique, from passive explanation to quiet frustration, as the workers and e-commerce entrepreneurs behind the cameras began pushing back against a narrative that had devalued them for years, insisting that made in China didn't mean cheap or inferior, but efficient, skilled, and foundational to the global economy. Because beneath the labels and logos, they argued, it was their hands, not European artisans, that cut the leather, stitched the seams, assembled the boxes, and packed the shipments. And yet they remained invisible in the story of luxury, erased by branding, diminished by stigma, and now, increasingly, denied access to the very markets they had helped build. The videos became part protest, part plea, and part strategy, a way to bypass broken trade channels, counter rising tariffs, and reach buyers directly, especially small businesses and mid-tier brands in the West who were now struggling to afford wholesale costs, but still needed inventory and saw in these videos not just cheap products, but transparency, speed, and a kind of authenticity the luxury world had never offered them. And so what began as content became commerce, and what began as commentary became confrontation. As more and more of these creators used their platforms to challenge the story the West tells about labor, luxury, and value, not just with claims, but with receipts, samples, and side-by-side comparisons that asked consumers to look, really look, at what they were paying for. Because if a $2,000 handbag and a $70 replica come from the same factory floor, made with the same leather, the same tools, and often by the same people, what exactly are we buying, and what are we paying for? As these videos spread across TikTok, drawing millions of views and triggering comment threads filled with disbelief, praise, and doubt, the conversation began to evolve, from mere shock at the cost breakdowns to something deeper, more uncomfortable, and more revealing. A reckoning with how much of the global consumer economy depends on a very specific illusion. That value comes from geography, from branding, from the mythology of European excellence, rather than from the people who actually make the product. And while Western luxury brands pushed back quietly, reaffirming that their handbags were made in France, their scarves in Italy, their shoes in Spain, the factory videos told a more complicated story, that yes, Perhaps the final stitching was done in a European workshop, or the last buckle attached under the supervision of a heritage-trained craftsman. But that much of the raw assembly, the cutting, the dyeing, the shaping, and even the sourcing of materials happened in China, in the same industrial parks now appearing on millions of screens. What once had been hidden as a feature, the invisibility of the labor behind prestige, was now exposed as a flaw, and the workers who had long been excluded from the narrative of luxury were beginning to demand recognition, not just as cogs in a supply chain, but as skilled artisans in their own right, deserving not only of credit, but of authorship, of presence, of voice. And it wasn't just about luxury anymore, because the same ecosystem of manufacturing, the same export channels, e-commerce models, and digital platforms was at the center of something much larger: the ongoing economic and political battle between the United States and China, a trade war that had begun with tariffs and escalated into regulations, restrictions, and rhetorical attacks as both countries vied for dominance not only in goods, but in influence. For years, platforms like Shein and Temu had thrived under a little-known rule, the de minimis exemption, which allowed goods under $800 to be shipped directly to U.S. consumers without tariffs or heavy regulation, creating a loophole through which millions of packages poured into American homes each month, filled with clothes, gadgets, household items, often made in the very factories now speaking out on TikTok. But as that loophole began to close, first through targeted tariffs, then through policy shifts under both the Trump and Biden administrations, the pipeline that had once connected Chinese manufacturers to American consumers began to narrow, and the pressure mounted. Factories that had once relied on bulk orders through major brands, then pivoted to direct-to-consumer platforms, were now looking for a new path. And many found it in content, in branding themselves not just as producers, but as personalities, creators, entrepreneurs, people who could speak directly to buyers across oceans without needing to wait for permission from Western companies who had profited from their silence. And for many of them, this wasn't just about commerce. It was personal. Because after decades of manufacturing for the world, of doing the dirty work while others took the credit, Chinese workers were beginning to push back against a narrative that labeled them as cheap, disposable, replaceable. A narrative that resurfaced again in the words of U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who in a speech dismissed them as peasants, triggering widespread backlash in China and reigniting a conversation about dignity, respect, and the global caste system that defines who gets to be called a craftsman and who is reduced to a statistic. On Chinese social media, the insult sparked rage, confusion, and a deep sense of injustice, not just because of what was said, but because of what it revealed. That even now, after years of building the backbone of global commerce, Chinese factory workers are still seen in some circles not as contributors to modern prosperity, but as faceless laborers on the margins of civilization. And so these videos, these simple, sometimes awkward, often quietly powerful TikToks, became a form of resistance, not just against tariffs or branding, but against invisibility itself. They were declarations of authorship, acts of self-recognition, and for many, the first time they had ever been seen by the people who buy the things they make. Not just as hands, but as faces, as voices, as people. And in those moments, stripped of branding and backstory, you begin to see the shape of something bigger. Not just a product, but a system. One in which value is created by many, but claimed by few. Where luxury is built on distance, between producer and consumer, between origin and narrative. And where that distance is finally starting to collapse under the weight of a camera phone and a Wi-Fi connection. Because when a young woman in Guangzhou shows you the stitching on a handbag nearly identical to one sold on Fifth Avenue, and tells you that the factory she works in produces for both high-end and budget labels, depending on the order and the buyer, it doesn't just challenge the brand, it challenges the very idea of what luxury means. Is it the quality of the material, the precision of the work, or is it the name, the story, printed on the tag? For generations, Western consumers have been taught to associate made in China with the cheap, the mass-produced, the disposable. A label that once signaled affordability, now often used as shorthand for inferiority, even as the very same supply chains have quietly powered the world's most celebrated brands, relying on Chinese efficiency, scale, and skill to deliver goods at margins that would be impossible to match in Europe or North America. And yet, despite that central role, despite the fact that more than 80% of luxury handbags, by some estimates, touch Chinese hands at some point in their creation, the workers who make them remain anonymous, uncredited, and often deliberately erased from the story consumers are sold. It's a kind of global amnesia, one that favors mystique over transparency and tradition over truth. But now, on a platform built for speed, honesty, and visual proof, that amnesia is starting to fade. Because these videos are not just content, they're counter-narratives, told not by marketers, but by makers, who have spent decades working in silence, and are now asking to be seen not just as producers of goods, but as creators of value. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, carries enormous weight, especially in a world where image often matters more than substance, and where the boundaries between product and persona, labor and luxury have always been carefully managed by those at the top. In one sense, these factory TikToks are a kind of digital labor strike. Not a walkout, but a call-in. An invitation to consumers to reconsider not only what they buy, but who they're buying it from, and what story they're being asked to believe. Because if the artisan is anonymous, if the work is invisible, if the origin is edited out, then who does the credit truly belong to? And more urgently, what happens when those workers, those factories, those nameless hands decide to tell the story themselves? Now that the veil has been pulled back, even just a little, it's hard to look away. Hard to unsee the rows of workers hunched over cutting tables, the neat stacks of leather and hardware, the stitching machines moving in rhythm with hands that will never be named in a product description, never be featured in a brand campaign, never be offered a share in the prestige they help create. Because the truth, once exposed, lingers, not just as a fact, but as a feeling. And while the luxury houses may continue to print tags that read "Made in France" or "Assembled in Italy," the quiet certainty is already spreading. That so much of what we believe about value, about quality, about sophistication, is less about where something is made and more about who is allowed to speak. And what's happening now, in the stitched-together moments of factory TikToks and behind-the-scenes breakdowns, is a slow reclaiming of that voice. A movement, however unpolished, to say that authorship matters, that visibility matters, that the act of making is not less valuable than the act of marketing, and that being a creator does not require a logo or a legacy, only a contribution that was always there, waiting to be seen. The workers behind the lens aren't asking to replace the brands. They're asking to be part of the story, to shift the frame just enough that the people behind the product become visible, and that "Made in China" no longer reads as a warning label, but as a sign of capability, creativity, and pride. And while the global system that feeds fast fashion, luxury branding, and international trade may resist that shift, because it thrives on distance, mystique, and the hierarchy between creator and consumer, the seed has already been planted, and it's growing. Not in marketing offices, but on factory floors, on shipping docks, in TikTok feeds and side-channel conversations where younger consumers, more curious, more skeptical, and more digitally fluent than their predecessors, are beginning to ask questions the industry has never had to answer. Questions about transparency, about fairness, about who really owns the right to call something luxury, and whether prestige is earned through heritage or simply purchased through story. And behind those questions is a new kind of excitement, not just in getting the look for less, but in bypassing the gatekeepers, in flipping the script, in watching a factory worker walk through the steps of assembling a product you've only seen under showroom lights, and realizing that the real power in the luxury world was never the name, it was the labor. And if that's true, then the future of commerce, of branding, of global perception may belong not to the storyteller, but to the one who finally decides to tell their own story. What we've witnessed isn't just a shift in content, it's a shift in control. For decades, the global marketplace has relied on invisibility, on the silence of the worker, the distance between maker and buyer, the story told by those who sell rather than those who build. But now, that distance is shrinking. The cameras are turning inward, and the people behind the product are stepping into the light. In a world where luxury was once defined by what was hidden, by rarity, mystery, the power of a brand to shape perception, perhaps the real luxury today is something else entirely. Maybe it's honesty. Maybe it's access. Maybe it's knowing the face behind the thread, the voice behind the hands, and understanding the journey not just of the product, but of the person who made it. The question now isn't whether the system will change. It's already changing. In small, flickering screens, in broken English, and quiet pride. In every stitched seam that's no longer anonymous. The real question is whether we're ready to change with it. Whether we still want the illusion, or whether we're finally ready to see the truth behind the price tag.